It is the night of April 14th, 1865. Washington, D.C. is alive. The city is celebrating. The most terrible war this country has ever seen is almost over. The killing fields have gone quiet. The cannons are cold. People are laughing in the streets, singing in the taverns, weeping with joy on their doorsteps. And tonight, inside Ford's Theater on 10th Street, 1,200 people have packed into their seats to watch a comedy called Our American Cousin. The gaslight chandeliers flicker gold above them, the velvet curtains are parted, the actors are performing, and the crowd is laughing. Up in the presidential box, a special balcony reserved for the most important guest of the evening, a tall man sits in a rocking chair. He is 56 years old, though he looks older. His face is deeply lined, carved by 4 years of war into something that looks almost like stone. But tonight, that face is relaxed. Tonight, for the first time in what feels like forever, he is at ease. He leans forward in his chair. He smiles at something the actor below has just said. The crowd laughs. He laughs, and in the shadows behind him, a door opens without a sound. A man steps through. He is holding a gun. To understand what happened that night, to truly understand it, we have to go back. All the way back. Back past the war, and the speeches, and the elections, and the heartbreak. Back to a one-room log cabin in Kentucky, deep in the wilderness, where a baby was born into a world that expected absolutely nothing from him at all. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln. Before we begin, I need you to understand something. Abraham Lincoln is not a statue. He is not a penny. He is not a face carved into a mountain. He was a person, a real, complicated, funny, sad, brilliant, broken, extraordinary human person, who was born with almost nothing, lost nearly everything that mattered to him, and still somehow managed to change the entire world. That is the story we are about to tell, and I promise you, it is one of the most remarkable stories in all of human history. Let's set the scene. The year is 1809. America is young, just 33 years old as a nation. There are no trains, there are no telephones, no electricity, no automobiles, no grocery stores, no hospitals, no internet. If you want light at night, you burn a candle. If you want to travel 100 miles, you walk or ride a horse. And if you get sick, really sick, there is not much anyone can do to help you. The country is expanding westward in a great rushing wave of settlers. Farmers, trappers, families with everything they own loaded into a wagon, heading into wild, uncharted territory. The forests of Kentucky and Indiana are dense and ancient and full of danger. Bears, wolves, panthers, biting cold in winter, and the ever-present threat of starvation. And in this world, this rough, raw, unforgiving world, there are millions of people who are living as enslaved human beings, forced to work without pay, without rights, without freedom, bought and sold like furniture. This is not a distant fact in 1809. This is the daily reality of American life. Slavery is legal, slavery is everywhere, and nobody yet knows the boy who will one day end it. He is about to be born. February 12th, 1809. Sinking Spring Farm, Hardin County, Kentucky. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You are standing in a frozen forest. It is bitter cold, the kind of cold that bites through every layer of clothing and settles into your bones like ice. Around you, trees, enormous oak and walnut trees, their bare branches black against a pale sky. The only sound is the wind and the distant cry of a bird. And there, in a small clearing, is the cabin. It is one room, one single room, about 16 feet wide and 18 feet long. No windows, no glass, no floor, just hard-packed dirt beneath your bare feet. The walls are rough logs, chinked with mud against the wind. There is a fireplace in one corner, and the fire is the only light, the only heat, the only thing standing between this family and the dark. Inside, a woman lies on a low bed made of wood and rope and animal skins. Her name is Nancy Hanks Lincoln. She is young, 26 years old, and she is giving birth. Her husband Thomas paces by the fire. He is a big, quiet man, a carpenter, a farmer. He cannot read or write his own name, but his hands are skilled and strong and steady. In the corner, watching with wide eyes, is a little girl. She is 2 years old. Her name is Sarah. And then in the cold and the firelight and the silence of the Kentucky wilderness, a baby boy is born. His name is Abraham Lincoln. Nobody celebrated. Nobody sent congratulations. Nobody predicted anything. A poor baby in a poor cabin in the middle of nowhere. That is all anyone saw. But the baby opened his eyes, and the firelight caught them, and he was here. The early years of Lincoln's life were simple, hard, and beautiful in the way that things can be beautiful when they are very close to the earth. Thomas Lincoln moved his family to a new farm at Knob Creek when Abraham was about 2, a lovely valley surrounded by high hills and deep gorges. Lincoln would later say that his earliest memories were of that place. The sound of the water over the rocks in the creek, the smell of wood smoke and pine, the feel of soft dirt under his bare feet in summer, and the sting of frost in October. He wore one rough linen shirt. That was his wardrobe. He and Sarah played in the creek, climbed trees, chased the chickens, and helped their parents with whatever needed doing, which was always something. His father Thomas was not a bad man. He worked hard, he loved his family, but he was restless, and he was unlucky, and he kept losing his land. A nightmare of the time called disputed titles, which meant that if someone came along and claimed your farm belonged to them on a technicality, you could lose everything you had built. His mother Nancy was something else entirely. Those who remembered Nancy Hanks Lincoln described her as quiet and gentle and deeply intelligent, with large dark eyes that seemed to hold everything she was thinking. She could not read. Almost nobody on the frontier could, but she loved to hear the Bible read aloud, and when there was a preacher nearby she would walk miles to listen. She told stories to her children by the fire. She sang to them. She had a tenderness that everyone noticed, and that her son Abraham would carry inside him for the rest of his life. Thomas Lincoln's ancestors had come from England to Massachusetts in 1637, generations before America was even a country. Lincoln was descended from a weaver's apprentice who crossed an ocean looking for a better life. Much like Lincoln himself would search for a better life his whole existence. In 1816, when Abraham was 7 years old, Thomas Lincoln packed up everything the family owned and moved them to Indiana. Why? 2 reasons. First, he had lost his Kentucky land again to another dispute over titles. He had worked that soil with his own hands, and now it was gone. Second, and perhaps more important, Kentucky was a slave state. That meant that owning enslaved people was legal there. Thomas Lincoln, a member of a deeply religious Baptist congregation, believed slavery was wrong. He wanted no part of it. He wanted to raise his family somewhere that slavery did not exist. So they crossed the Ohio River and pushed deep into the wilderness of southern Indiana, which had just become a state and was free territory, and they started over. Indiana in 1816 was not tamed land. It was wild. The forest was so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. There were panthers in the hills and bears in the hollows and wolves that howled at night close enough to make the firelight seem very small. 7-year-old Abraham Lincoln was given an axe and told to help clear the land. Can you imagine that? Being 7 years old and swinging a full-sized axe at the base of trees that had stood for 200 years. That was his life. But here is what you need to know about Abraham Lincoln, even at age 7. He was different. He was curious in a way that could not be explained by where he came from. He noticed everything. He listened to every conversation the adults had and turned it over in his mind like a stone he was trying to read the underside of. He memorized the Bible passages his mother talked about. He made up rhymes and little poems and told stories to his sister Sarah that made her fall off her log laughing. And when someone read a book aloud, even a page, even a paragraph, Abraham went still as a held breath and absorbed every word. Books were not common things in 1816 Indiana. They were rare and precious, sometimes the only book a family owned. But Abraham Lincoln had already decided, even as a boy who could barely read, that words were the most important things in the world. He did not yet know why. He was about to find out. Because first, before any of that, something was coming to the Lincoln cabin, something silent and invisible and devastating, moving through the Indiana forest like a shadow. And it was going to change everything. The autumn of 1818 arrived in the Indiana woods the way autumn always did, with red and gold and the first bite of real cold. But this year it brought something terrible with it, something the settlers called milk sickness. Here is what milk sickness was, in simple terms. Cows in Indiana would sometimes eat a wild plant called white snakeroot, which grew in the forests. The plant was poisonous, but it didn't immediately kill the cow. Instead, the poison passed into the cow's milk, and when people drank that milk without knowing anything was wrong, they got sick. Very sick. You would start with weakness, then nausea, then trembling. Then you would stop being able to keep food down. It moved through a family like fire through dry grass. You could be healthy in the morning and burning with fever by nightfall. Nancy Hanks Lincoln was 34 years old. She had nursed her neighbors through it. She had watched it take 3 of Thomas's relatives, his aunt, his uncle, their young daughter, in a matter of weeks. And then it came for her. She was sick for 1 week, then a second. Abraham was 9 years old. He sat beside her bed and watched her face. He held her hand, which was thin and very warm. He watched her breathing, slow and slower. His sister Sarah, 11 years old, tried to cook and keep the cabin clean and care for both the patients and the younger children. She was too young for any of it, and she did all of it anyway. Thomas Lincoln built his wife's coffin with his own hands. He cut the wood himself. He shaped the boards himself. He hammered every nail himself, because there was nobody else, because that was what frontier life was. On October 5th, 1818, in the red and gold of an Indiana autumn, Nancy Hanks Lincoln was buried in the forest near their cabin. Abraham Lincoln never forgot that day. He never forgot the sound of the dirt going to the grave, or the cold of the air, or the way the forest seemed to close in around the little clearing, as if it didn't care, as if the world just kept being the world no matter what was happening to the people inside it. He was 9 years old, and he had just lost his mother. And here is something important, something historians have wrestled with for 200 years. Abraham Lincoln carried a profound, unshakable sadness inside him for the rest of his life. He called it the Hippo. He talked about a darkness that lived in him that never fully went away, and almost everyone who has studied his life carefully believes that this sadness, this melancholy, was planted in that Indiana forest when he was 9, when the world first showed him what it could take away. But loss, it turns out, was not the only thing the forest brought. A year after Nancy's death, Thomas Lincoln rode back to Kentucky and returned with something remarkable, a new wife. Her name was Sarah Bush Johnston. She was a widow with 3 children of her own. She came to the Lincoln cabin in a wagon loaded with furniture, real furniture, a proper bed with feather mattresses, a table, a chest of drawers, pots and pans, knives and forks, things the Lincoln children had never owned. But more than the furniture, much more than the furniture, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln brought warmth. She stepped into that cabin, and she saw 2 children who were dirty and half-starved and hollow with grief, and she immediately took charge. She set the children to washing. She had Thomas fix the floor and cut windows in the walls. She made the cabin into something that felt like a home. And then she looked at Abraham. She saw him immediately for what he was. She later said, and this is real, these are her own words recorded by people who interviewed her. She said that Abraham was the best boy I ever saw. She pushed Thomas to send him to school when a school was available. She gave him books. She treated him like her own child from the very first day. She may have saved him. Without Sarah Bush Johnston, without that woman who arrived like a wagon full of warmth on a frozen Indiana morning, it is possible that the boy with the curious mind and the hungry heart would have stayed broken, would have stayed in the dark. Instead, something in young Abraham Lincoln began to grow. Here is a question I want you to think about. How much school did Abraham Lincoln attend in his entire life? The answer is less than 12 months, total, in his whole entire childhood. That's it. No high school, no college, no academy, no tutors, no proper education of any kind. Less time in a classroom than most of you have spent there in a single year. The small frontier schools that Lincoln did attend, blab schools they were called, had no desks, no textbooks, and sometimes no roof. Students sat on rough benches, and they all recited their lessons out loud at the same time, so the teacher could hear them. That is why they were called blab schools, because of the constant, overlapping noise of children blabbing their recitations. Lincoln hated the noise and the chaos. He wanted to sit quietly and think. And yet Abraham Lincoln became one of the greatest writers in the English language, one of the greatest speakers, a man whose words echoed across a century and are still being quoted today. How? He taught himself. That is the simple, staggering answer. He borrowed books from every neighbor within walking distance, and sometimes walking distance meant 5 miles in each direction, through woods, in the dark, in the snow. He would walk those miles, borrow a single book, walk back, and then read it by firelight until the fire burned low. He read the King James Bible so many times he had long passages memorized. The rhythm of that book, the rise and fall of its sentences, the way it built to something and then came back down, sank into Abraham's bones like music. You can hear it later in every speech he ever wrote. He read Aesop's fables, those ancient Greek stories where animals speak, and every story has a lesson hidden inside it, because Lincoln loved stories that held a bigger truth inside. He read Robinson Crusoe, about a man stranded alone in the wilderness who survived by his wits. He read The Pilgrim's Progress. He read a biography of George Washington that gave him his first sense of what a nation could be and what kind of person it required. He once said that he could not remember a time when he could not read. He had learned so young, so naturally, so hungrily, that reading became as necessary as breathing. When he had no paper, and he often had no paper, he wrote on a wooden shovel with a charcoal stick, practicing his letters, forming his sentences, then planning the surface smooth and starting over. Abraham Lincoln was extraordinarily tall for his era. By his late teens, he stood 6 feet, 4 inches, in a time when the average American man was about 5 feet 7 inches. He towered over nearly everyone he met, and he was not just tall. He was powerfully built, with enormous hands and the muscles of a man who had swung an axe every day of his childhood. He was famous throughout the county as one of the strongest young men around, and could reportedly carry 500 pounds. The combination of that powerful laboring body and that reading, dreaming, poetry-memorizing mind was one of the most unexpected things about Lincoln. He was a paradox from the very beginning. His neighbors noticed him. People would remark on the skinny tall boy walking down the road at dusk with a book tucked under his arm. They would see him leaning against a fence reading while others rested. They would hear him tell a story, and what a storyteller he was. He could make people laugh so hard they had to sit down. He could mimic voices and accents, build a scene, let it breathe, and then deliver a punchline that nobody saw coming. Laughter, for Abraham Lincoln, was the other side of sadness. He needed both. He used both. He also worked, furiously. He split fence rails, thousands of them. He helped neighbors with their harvests. He hired himself out for odd jobs when the family needed money, and by Indiana law at the time, everything he earned belonged to his father until he turned 21. So he worked, and he gave the money away, and he kept reading. There was a grief and a tenderness in Abraham Lincoln that never left him. Even as a boy, he was the one who would stop to help an injured animal, who would be unable to sleep if he thought he had treated someone unkindly. His stepsister later recalled how he wept when the local boys were being cruel to animals, and how he pleaded with them to stop. He felt things deeply. That was both his great strength and the source of his suffering. He could not look away from pain, not in animals, not in people, not in the world around him. His sister Sarah was still his closest companion. She was bright and loving, and kept the household from falling apart with quiet competence. She looked out for Abraham the way older sisters do, with exasperation and fierce loyalty in equal measure. And then, in 1828, when Abraham was 19 and Sarah was 21, she died in childbirth. The baby did not survive either. Lincoln received the news while he was working away from home. And those who saw his face said that something in it went very quiet and very still, in a way that was frightening. He had now lost his mother and his only sister, 2 of the 3 people who had loved him most completely in the world. He was 19 years old, and he was just getting started, because something was pulling Abraham Lincoln out of that Indiana forest and toward a bigger world, something he couldn't entirely explain yet. He only knew that he had to go. He had to see what was out there, and what he saw on the first trip he ever took away from home would plant a seed inside him that would change the history of the entire world. In 1828, when he was just 19 years old, Abraham Lincoln made his first trip down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans on a flatboat, a big, flat-bottomed wooden cargo boat used to ship goods to the Deep South. He was hired as a crew member. His job was to help load the boat, steer through the current, and unload it when they arrived. For a boy who had never been farther from home than he could walk in a day, it was like traveling to the moon. New Orleans, in 1828, nearly 100,000 people. Brick buildings 5 stories tall, ships from every port in the world crowding the harbor, music floating out of tavern windows, the smell of the ocean for the first time in his life. Lincoln walked those streets with his head turning like a compass needle, taking everything in. He was 20 years old by the time he returned home, and everything he saw was stored in that extraordinary memory, catalogued and kept. But there was something else he saw in New Orleans, something that did not go into his memory as an adventure. Stand with Abraham Lincoln on a street in New Orleans in the summer heat. The air is thick and wet and smells of river mud and magnolias and something sharper underneath. Something wrong. You hear it before you see it, voices, crying, the sound of chains. You turn a corner, and you are standing in front of a slave market. In the open air, on a raised wooden platform, men in fine coats stand at a podium. Around them, chained in rows, are human beings. Men, women, and children, torn from their families, stripped of their names, their history, their futures, being sold, one by one, like property. A mother holds her child and tries not to make eye contact with the buyers who walk around them like they are inspecting horses. A man, tall, dignified, silent, stands with his chin up, as if the last thing he owns is his own dignity, and he will not let them have it. Lincoln stands on that street and watches. He does not look away. We know from those who knew him that this experience shook Lincoln to his foundation. He had grown up opposing slavery in the abstract, his father's religion, the Indiana Free State he lived in. But abstract opposition was very different from standing on a New Orleans street and watching it happen, watching children separated from their parents, watching human beings appraised and purchased. One person who traveled with Lincoln recalled that after the slave market, Lincoln was unusually quiet for a long time, and then he said something to the effect that if he ever got the chance to hit that thing, meaning slavery, he would hit it hard. He was 20 years old. 3 years later, in 1831, Lincoln made a second flatboat trip to New Orleans. By this time, his family had moved to Illinois, and on his return, he decided not to go home. He was 22 years old. He had just arrived in a small town on the Sangamon River in Illinois called New Salem, and he decided to stay. New Salem, Illinois, was a town of about 100 people when Lincoln arrived. There was a general store, a mill, a tavern, a cooper shop, and a handful of small houses. It no longer exists. It was abandoned when a bigger town nearby grew, and New Salem's river traffic dried up. Today it has been reconstructed as a historical site in Illinois, so you can walk those same dirt streets that Lincoln walked as a young man. New Salem was where Abraham Lincoln became Abraham Lincoln. He was hired as a store clerk. He became the town's postmaster. He taught himself surveying, measuring and mapping land from books. He made friends easily with his humor and his stories and his absolute, unmistakable honesty. Here is one of the most famous Lincoln stories from New Salem. One day, after working as a store clerk, he realized he had accidentally overcharged a customer 6 cents. 6 cents, less than what a nickel is worth today. He walked miles that evening to return the money. 6 cents miles in the dark. That is who he was. People called him Honest Abe, not as a campaign slogan, as a simple statement of fact. If Abe Lincoln told you something, it was true. If Abe Lincoln shook your hand on a deal, it was done. Shortly after arriving in New Salem, Lincoln became famous throughout the region for a wrestling match against a man named Jack Armstrong, who was the local champion, a giant of a man, strong and wild, and the leader of a rough gang called the Clary's Grove Boys. The match was watched by the entire town. The details differ depending on who you ask, but what everyone agrees on is this: Lincoln either won outright or fought Armstrong to such a complete standstill that Armstrong himself declared Lincoln the finest wrestler he had ever faced. After that, the Clary's Grove boys, who had expected to humiliate the awkward newcomer, became Lincoln's fiercest supporters. He had won them not by backing down, but by standing his ground. Lincoln also served briefly in the Illinois militia during the Black Hawk War of 1832, a conflict between American settlers and a group of Sauk people led by their chief Black Hawk. Lincoln was elected captain of his militia unit, which he later described with characteristic humor, saying that in the Black Hawk War the only blood he shed was in battles with the mosquitoes, and that he had not lost a single battle against them. That self-deprecating humor, that ability to make himself the butt of a joke, was part of what made Lincoln so irresistible. He was the smartest person in most rooms, and he had learned never to let you feel it. In 1832, Lincoln ran for the Illinois state legislature. He lost. He was 23 years old, had almost no money, and was completely unknown outside of New Salem. He ran again in 1834. This time he won. The boy from the dirt floor cabin had just entered politics. But becoming a politician without a law degree is like trying to build a house without knowing how to use the tools. Lincoln knew what he needed, and he was about to pursue it in the only way he knew how, with nothing but books, a burning mind, and a refusal to stop. Abraham Lincoln wanted to be a lawyer. He had no money for law school. He had no connections in the legal world. He had no mentor who could take him under his wing. So he did what he always did when he needed to learn something. He got the books, and he taught himself. He borrowed every law book he could find within reach of New Salem. He read Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, a massive, dense legal textbook, cover to cover, multiple times. He read it walking. He read it in the shade of trees, with a book balanced on his knees. He read it lying on his back in the grass, holding it above his face, his lips sometimes moving as he worked through an argument. He argued cases out loud to himself. He practiced speaking. He worked through legal logic like a puzzle, because that is what it was, a puzzle, and Lincoln loved puzzles. In 1836, Abraham Lincoln was admitted to the Illinois bar, meaning he was now officially a lawyer. In April of 1837, he moved to Springfield, Illinois, the state capital, with all his worldly possessions loaded into 2 saddlebags. Springfield would be his home for the next 24 years. He became a circuit lawyer, meaning he rode on horseback, twice a year, around a circuit of 14 counties across Illinois, stopping at each county seat to argue cases. The circuit covered about 450 miles in total. He rode in all weather, through mud and snow and summer heat, sleeping in cramped taverns or with generous strangers, sharing beds with other lawyers and judges, telling stories by the fireplace at night until people's sides hurt from laughing. Lincoln was one of the most successful lawyers in Illinois by the time he entered national politics. He argued cases before the Illinois Supreme Court regularly. One of his most famous cases was the Almanac trial of 1858, in which he defended a man accused of murder. The key witness claimed to have seen the murder by moonlight, from a long distance, in the middle of the night. Lincoln dramatically produced an almanac showing that, on the night in question, the moon had set early, and would not have been in a position to provide the light the witness claimed. The defendant was acquitted. It reads like something from a movie, because Lincoln was that good. He was known throughout the legal circuit as one of the fairest attorneys anyone had ever encountered. He would sometimes tell clients, honestly, that they didn't have a case, and send them home without charging them. "You'd better settle this case," he would say. "Win or lose, you'll come out worse than if you settle." Clients adored him and trusted him completely. Lincoln never charged poor clients. If someone came to him who genuinely could not afford a lawyer, he took their case for free. He believed that the law was for everyone, not just the wealthy. This was deeply unusual for the time, and it made him beloved by ordinary people across Illinois. But underneath the humor and the legal brilliance and the easy sociability, there was a darkness that Lincoln struggled with his entire life. He called it the hypo, short for hypochondria, which in the 19th century was used to describe what we now recognize as clinical depression. Episodes could come on without warning and leave Lincoln unable to get out of bed for days at a time. His friends recalled finding him sometimes sitting alone in the dark, perfectly still, with a grief on his face that had no particular cause. It was just there, living inside him. He was remarkably open about it with people he trusted. He talked about it. He didn't hide it. He told a close friend once that he would not wish his darkest thoughts on any enemy. This is important, because Lincoln became one of the greatest leaders in human history, and he did it while fighting, quietly and privately, a darkness that never left him. That is not a weakness. That is one of the most extraordinary things about him. He carried the grief, and he kept going, every single day. He was becoming something, out there on the prairie, growing into himself, getting stronger, getting smarter, getting deeper. But there was one more thing he was searching for, one more thing he needed, though he might not have been able to name it yet. Someone to come home to. And on that front, life was about to give Abraham Lincoln more joy and more pain than almost any man could bear. Before Mary there was Anne. Anne Rutledge was a young woman in New Salem, the daughter of one of the town's founders. She was bright and kind and widely liked. Lincoln knew her well. Whether they were in love, truly in love, in the way romance means, is something historians have debated for nearly 2 centuries. The evidence is partial and complicated. Some who knew them believed Lincoln carried a deep affection for her. Others argue it has been exaggerated by later storytellers. Here is what we know for certain. Anne Rutledge died in August of 1835 of typhoid fever at the age of 22. And after her death, Abraham Lincoln entered one of the most severe depressive episodes of his life. His friends were genuinely frightened for him. One neighbor later recalled that they hid his razor from him during that period, worried about what he might do, whether it was romantic grief or simply the grief of losing another person he loved in a world that kept taking people away. We cannot know for certain, but it shook him badly. And then in 1839, at a dance in Springfield, Abraham Lincoln met Mary Todd. She was 21 years old, just arrived from Kentucky, staying with her sister. She was educated, genuinely, formally educated, which was unusual for women of her time. She spoke fluent French. She had read Shakespeare and Byron and the classics. She was sharp and witty and quick and had a political mind that rivaled anyone in the room. She was also from one of the wealthiest families in Kentucky, her father a successful merchant and slave owner. And Abraham Lincoln, tall, awkward, poor, wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, with mud still on his boots from the road, walked across a room and asked her to dance. She said yes. He later said, with a smile, that he had wanted to dance with her in the worst possible way, and she told friends, more than once, that she believed this strange, funny, serious, brilliant man was going to be President of the United States someday. She believed it before he believed it himself. Their courtship was not smooth. Lincoln broke off their engagement once, in early January of 1841, a decision that immediately plunged him into one of the darkest periods of his life. He later described that broken engagement as the thing in his life he felt worst about. He had hurt her. He had acted from doubt and fear, and he knew it. They reconciled about a year later. On November 4th, 1842, Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd were married in the parlor of Mary's sister's home. He wore a new suit. She wore a white satin dress. He was 33 years old. She was 23. Lincoln had a gold ring made for Mary with the inscription, "Love is eternal," engraved on the inside. She wore it for the rest of her life. Their marriage was real and complicated and deep, like any real marriage. Mary was not easy. She had a sharp temper and high expectations, and could be difficult in ways that were widely noted. Lincoln was moody, absorbed in his own thoughts, frequently absent on the legal circuit for months at a time. They disagreed fiercely. They made up. They laughed together, and they laughed a great deal. They were devoted to each other in a way that ran underneath all the difficulty, like bedrock. They had 4 sons. Robert Todd Lincoln, born in 1843. He was the eldest, serious, somewhat distant from his famous father, the only Lincoln son who survived to old age. Edward Eddie Baker Lincoln, born in 1846. Eddie was their second son, a gentle, quiet child who died in February of 1850 at just 3 years old of tuberculosis. The grief of Eddie's death marked both parents for years. William Willie Wallace Lincoln, born in 1850. Willie was, by every account, Lincoln's favorite. He was a curious, bookish, sensitive boy who reminded Lincoln of himself. Everyone who met Willie saw something extraordinary in him. Thomas Tad Lincoln, born in 1853. They called him Tad, short for tadpole, because his head seemed too big for his tiny body when he was born. Tad was wild and funny and reckless, and the light of his father's eye. Lincoln, as a father, was one of the great joys of his life. He was famously indulgent, letting the boys run wild, playing with them on the floor, letting them interrupt his work, giving them whatever they asked for. His law partner William Herndon once wrote, with a mixture of admiration and exasperation, that Lincoln let his boys rip up the law office on visits, and never said a word to stop them. He loved them without reservation, without conditions, which is why what was coming, years later, in the White House, was going to be almost impossible to survive. But that was still ahead. First, the world was about to call Abraham Lincoln's name. The question of slavery, the question he had carried since New Orleans, since that Indiana forest, since the moment he first heard his father say it was wrong, was about to explode into a national crisis, and Lincoln was about to find himself standing in the middle of it. To understand what happened next, you need to understand one thing. The country was tearing itself apart. Slavery had existed in America since before the country was founded. Millions of human beings, by the 1850s, more than 3 million, were held in bondage in the southern states. They worked the fields, the kitchens, the shipyards. They built the wealth of the South with their bodies and their blood, and received nothing in return. Nothing. Not freedom, not wages, not the right to keep their own children. Slavery was not an abstraction. It was people, real people with names and families and futures that were being stolen from them every single day. And the question that was tearing America apart in the 1850s was this. As the country expanded westward and new territories became new states, would slavery be allowed to spread into those new states? In 1854, a senator from Illinois named Stephen A. Douglas, a short, powerful, supremely confident man they called the Little Giant, pushed through a law called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act effectively reopened the question of slavery in new territories, threatening to allow it to spread into places that had previously been protected. And Abraham Lincoln, who had stepped back from politics for a few years, felt something rise in him like fire. He came back. He re-entered politics with a speech that stopped Illinois cold. He had always believed slavery was morally wrong. He had said so quietly, privately, in conversation. Now he was saying it publicly, forcefully, politically. He was standing on a platform and using that extraordinary voice, trained by years of storytelling, shaped by the Bible and Shakespeare and Aesop, to make the argument that slavery was incompatible with everything America claimed to stand for. If the Negro is a man, Lincoln said, then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man making a slave of another. On June 16, 1858, Abraham Lincoln received the Republican nomination to run for the United States Senate against Stephen Douglas, and in his acceptance speech he said something that echoed through every newspaper in America. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. He took those words straight from the Bible, the Gospel of Mark, and turned them into a political statement so clear and so powerful that it silenced a room of seasoned politicians. Then came the Lincoln-Douglas debates. 7 debates, 7 cities across Illinois. Over the course of the summer and fall of 1858, Lincoln and Douglas squared off in one of the most extraordinary public arguments in American history. The Lincoln-Douglas debates drew crowds of 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 people, in an era when there were no microphones, no amplifiers, no screens. People stood in fields and on hillsides and craned their necks to see. Reporters from newspapers across the country took down every word in shorthand and printed them the next morning. These debates were more important and more watched than any sporting event could have been. They were arguing about the soul of the nation. Douglas came to the debates like a conquering hero, arriving by private rail car, with servants and secretaries, wearing fine clothes, surrounded by admirers. He was the most famous politician in America. Lincoln arrived on the regular train with everyone else. But when they stood side by side on that platform, the Little Giant and the Tall Stranger, and the debate began, something remarkable happened. Lincoln was not intimidated. He was not outclassed. He was something Douglas had not prepared for. He was better. He used logic and language and humor and moral clarity and the kind of storytelling that made 20,000 people lean forward at the same time. When Douglas attacked him, Lincoln smiled and turned the attack back with something so simple and so devastating that the crowd burst into laughter. And that was that. One moment a heckler shouted that Lincoln was two-faced. Lincoln looked at the crowd with perfect seriousness and said, "If I had two faces, do you think I'd be wearing this one?" He lost the Senate race, but the debates had been printed in newspapers across the country, and the name Abraham Lincoln was now known from New York to the Mississippi. He had lost the battle. The war was just beginning, and in 2 years he was going to walk into the most powerful room in the world, a room nobody thought he was ready for, least of all himself. February 27, 1860, New York City. Abraham Lincoln stepped onto a stage at the Cooper Union, one of the most prestigious lecture halls in the country, to speak to an audience of New York's most important citizens. These were educated, skeptical people. They knew their famous politicians. They had heard the great orators of the age. They did not know this man. Lincoln had traveled from Illinois for this one speech. He had prepared it for months, doing research so thorough that one historian later called it the most meticulously documented political speech ever written to that point in American history. He rose. He was awkward at first. He always was, at the beginning, when people were still getting used to the way he looked. He was not what they expected a great man to look like. And then he began to speak. He spoke for 90 minutes. He dismantled, one by one, every argument for the spread of slavery, using logic and history and constitutional evidence so precise and so thorough that by the end the room was completely silent, and then erupted into one of the greatest ovations that auditorium had ever heard. The next morning, 5 New York newspapers printed the entire speech in full, which was almost unheard of. Lincoln walked out of that building a national figure. May 1860, the Republican National Convention in Chicago. Lincoln was not the front-runner. The front-runner was a senator from New York named William Seward, a polished, famous, experienced politician. Lincoln's team, led by a brilliant political operator named Judge David Davis, worked the convention floor with absolute ferocity, making deals, promising cabinet positions, building coalitions. On the first ballot, Seward led. On the second ballot, Lincoln was closing. On the third ballot, Lincoln won the nomination. When the news arrived in Springfield that night, telegraph messages flying across the state, Lincoln ran home to tell Mary. He burst through the door and said, "Mary, Mary, we are elected." We. The election of 1860 was one of the most chaotic in American history. The Democratic Party had split into two, North and South, and was running 2 different candidates. That split gave Lincoln an opening. He won. He won without carrying a single Southern state. In fact, his name did not even appear on the ballot in most of them. And before he was even inaugurated, before he had spent one single day in office, 7 Southern states announced that they were leaving the United States of America. They were forming their own separate nation, the Confederate States of America, because they would not be governed by a man who believed slavery was wrong. Lincoln traveled to Washington in February of 1861. There were credible assassination plots, a scheme in Baltimore specifically designed to kill him in transit. He arrived in the city in the middle of the night, in disguise, on a secret train. The President-elect of the United States had to sneak into his own capital. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States. He stood on the steps of the Capitol and gave a speech, calm, measured, sorrowful, urgent, begging the Southern states to step back from the edge, calling them his countrymen, reminding them of what they shared, saying that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. "We are not enemies," he said, "but friends. We must not be enemies." They did not listen. April 12, 1861. Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a United States military fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. For 34 hours they bombarded it. The Union garrison was forced to surrender. The Civil War had begun, and Abraham Lincoln, a man who had never commanded anything larger than a ragged Illinois militia unit during the Black Hawk War, was now the commander-in-chief of the United States Army. He was going to have to learn to fight a war. He was going to have to learn fast, because the war was going to be worse than anyone imagined. The Civil War. Say those words and let them land. The Civil War. The most terrible conflict in American history. Over 4 years of fighting. Over 600,000 Americans killed, more than in every other American war combined. Brothers fighting brothers. Fathers fighting sons. A country tearing itself in half. And in the middle of it all, in the White House, which was not a fortress, but a working building open to any citizen who wanted to line up and wait, sat Abraham Lincoln. Nobody had prepared him for this. There was no preparation that could have been enough. He had been a lawyer and a legislator. He knew nothing about military strategy, or rather, he knew nothing when the war started. So he did what he always did when he needed to know something. He got the books. He borrowed military strategy texts from the Library of Congress and read them late into the night. He studied maps until he understood the geography of the war as well as any general. He met with his commanders constantly, listening, asking questions, pushing for action when his cautious generals wanted to wait. And he went to the hospitals. This is the part that people don't always know. Lincoln visited the military hospitals around Washington, again and again throughout the war, and he walked through the wards. He stopped at every cot. He spoke to every soldier he could reach. He held their hands. He listened to their stories. When they were dying, he stayed with them. He memorized the names of the states they came from. He wept with men he had never met. Doctors and nurses who worked those hospitals recalled Lincoln walking through with tears running silently down his face, stopping to speak quietly to each man, leaving no one unacknowledged. He could not bear for them to feel abandoned, because he felt responsible for each one of them. Every man who died in that war, every death on both sides, Lincoln carried inside him. He said once that there was a tired spot in him that no amount of rest could touch. Look at photographs of Lincoln. In 1861, he looks like a middle-aged man with a new beard and cautious eyes. By 1865, he looks like an old man. He looks like he has aged 30 years and 4. The hollows in his cheeks, the deep furrows between his brows, the eyes, which are the same eyes, the same intelligence, the same warmth, but now carrying something enormous behind them. That was the war. That was what he carried. The early battles were disasters for the Union. Bull Run, a humiliation, a series of missed opportunities by cautious generals who would not attack when Lincoln needed them to attack. Lincoln cycled through commander after commander, searching for someone who would fight. Then came the Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862. A single day of fighting along Antietam Creek in Maryland. 23,000 Americans killed or wounded in one single day. The bloodiest single day in American history. The Union held the field, but the Confederate General Robert E. Lee escaped across the Potomac, and Lincoln's cautious General George McClellan did not pursue him. Lincoln was furious. He fired McClellan. He was searching for a general who understood what was needed, someone who would fight relentlessly until the war was won. He found him eventually in a man named Ulysses S. Grant, who was winning battles in the West. In 1864, Lincoln put Grant in command of all Union armies. "I can't spare this man," Lincoln said of Grant. "He fights." But the greatest blow of Lincoln's war years was not a battle. It was a bedroom. In February of 1862, 11-year-old Willie Lincoln, the quiet, bookish, gentle boy who everyone who knew him called extraordinary, fell gravely ill. Typhoid fever, most likely from the polluted water that flowed into the White House from the sewage-contaminated Potomac River. Lincoln sat at Willie's bedside. Mary sat at Willie's bedside. They kept vigil for days. On February 20th, 1862, Willie Lincoln died. He was 11 years old. Lincoln was led from the room. He walked into his secretary John Nicolay's office, and he said, "My boy is gone. He is actually gone." And he burst into tears. A nurse named Rebecca Pomeroy was in the White House that night. She later wrote that she had never seen a man so bowed down with grief in her life. Lincoln returned to Willie's room several times in the days after the boy's death, alone, closing the door behind him, and wept over his son's body. Mary collapsed into a grief so profound she could not function. She never entered Willie's room again. She never entered the guest room where she had nursed him again. She went into black mourning clothes, and she stayed in them for months. And Lincoln, in the middle of all of this, still had a war to run. He still had to meet with his cabinet, sign orders, read dispatches, make decisions that were going to send more men to their deaths. He told a friend, "I laugh because I must not weep. That's all, that's all." That line tells you everything about Abraham Lincoln. He still told stories. He still had his cabinet in stitches sometimes, even in the darkest moments of the war. They didn't always understand it. Some of his advisers were actually offended by the levity, but Lincoln knew what he was doing. He was choosing, consciously and deliberately, to keep going, to not be crushed, to find the human things, the humor, the story, the small moment of joy, and use them to survive. And while he was doing all of this, running a war, losing his son, barely sleeping, aging by the year, he was also doing the most important thing a president had ever done in American history. He was preparing to set millions of people free. January 1st, 1863. New Year's Day. Abraham Lincoln sat at his desk and picked up a pen. He had been shaking hands with visitors at a White House reception for several hours. His right hand was swollen and trembling from the greetings. He flexed his fingers. He looked at the document in front of him. He said to the people around him, "If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." And he signed his full name, Abraham Lincoln, in a slow, deliberate hand. It was the Emancipation Proclamation. Here is what the Emancipation Proclamation said, in simple terms. As of January 1st, 1863, all enslaved people in states that were currently in rebellion against the United States, the Confederate States, were declared to be free. Now, and this is important to be honest about, it had real limitations. It could not free enslaved people in the border states that had stayed in the Union, because Lincoln needed those states on his side. It could not be enforced immediately in Confederate territory, because the Confederates did not recognize Lincoln's authority. It was, technically, a war measure. Lincoln issued it under his wartime powers as commander-in-chief. But its meaning went far beyond its legal limits. What the Emancipation Proclamation said to the world was this: the Civil War was now officially, permanently, irrevocably about slavery, not just about preserving the Union, about ending the thing that was fundamentally, morally wrong with America. Lincoln had made it impossible to go back. In black communities across the North, in churches, in homes, in the streets, people wept and prayed and embraced each other when the news came. They called Lincoln Father Abraham. They sang. They held their children and told them what it meant. Lincoln's views on slavery had always been clear in one direction. He believed it was wrong. Morally, fundamentally, unambiguously wrong. He had believed that since childhood. But his views on what the government could and should do, and what he himself was able to do within the law, had evolved over time, and with the war, they had finally reached their destination. Among those who watched Lincoln's journey most closely and most critically was Frederick Douglass. Douglass was one of the greatest Americans who ever lived. He had been born into slavery in Maryland, had escaped to freedom at the age of 20, and had become the most powerful anti-slavery voice in the nation. He was a speaker of breathtaking eloquence. He was an author, an activist, a leader. July 1st through 3rd, 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg. 3 days of fighting in the hills and fields of southern Pennsylvania. 50,000 Americans killed, wounded, or missing. The bloodiest battle of the Civil War. The turning point of the war, when the Confederacy's attempt to push into the North was broken and turned back. In November of 1863, the government was preparing to dedicate a new national military cemetery on the battlefield, a place to bury properly and honor the Union dead. Lincoln was invited to say a few appropriate remarks. The main speaker at the Gettysburg dedication was not Abraham Lincoln. It was a man named Edward Everett, the most famous orator in America at that time, a former Secretary of State, former president of Harvard. He spoke for 2 hours, a speech of 13,000 words. He was magnificent. When it was over, people applauded and congratulated him. Then Lincoln rose. He spoke for 2 minutes. His speech was 272 words, and today almost nobody knows what Everett said. Everyone knows what Lincoln said. Everett himself wrote to Lincoln the next day, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." November 19th, 1863, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Lincoln stood. He held his prepared remarks. He looked out at the crowd, the thousands of people, the fresh graves just barely settled, the November sky pressing down like a hand. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. 77, that means 87 years. He is counting back to 1776, to the Declaration of Independence, to the moment someone wrote for the first time that all men are created equal. He is asking, did we mean it? Were those words real, or were they just words? Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. This is the test. This war, this bloodshed, these 50,000 graves around us, this is whether a country built on the idea of equality can survive, whether democracy works, whether the dream is real. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. But, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. What he means, no speech can honor these men as much as what they did. Words cannot reach what these soldiers did. The ground itself, soaked in their blood, is the consecration. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. He was wrong about that one thing. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The crowd was quiet for a moment. Then the applause began. 272 words, 2 minutes. And in those words, Abraham Lincoln had redefined what the war was about, not just preserving the old Union, but creating something new, a nation that actually lived up to its own founding promise. A nation where all men are created equal was not a poetic aspiration, but a living commitment. A new birth of freedom. He put it in the plain American speech he'd learned from the Bible and Aesop and the voices of ordinary people all his life. Not fancy, not academic, just true. The war was not over. The worst was not over. Lincoln had another election to survive, another winter to endure, another speech to give, one that many consider the greatest in all of American history. But first, he had to find out whether his own country was going to keep him in office long enough to finish the work. The summer of 1864 was the darkest season of Abraham Lincoln's presidency. The war was going badly. Grant's armies were grinding forward, but suffering enormous losses, 32,000 men in 2 weeks in some campaigns. The North was exhausted. Northern morale was collapsing. People were tired of the killing. And Lincoln's re-election in November was coming. Lincoln himself believed he was going to lose. He wrote a private memo in August of 1864, sealed it in an envelope, and had his cabinet members sign the outside without reading it. It said, in effect, "I believe I will lose this election, and when I do, I will cooperate fully in the transition of power so that whoever wins can still save the Union before March." He thought he was going to lose. His opponent was his former general, George B. McClellan, the cautious, frustrating commander Lincoln had fired, running on a platform of negotiating peace with the Confederacy, which meant accept the permanent division of the country, which meant slavery continues. And then something happened. September 2nd, 1864. Word arrived in Washington. General William Tecumseh Sherman had captured Atlanta, Georgia. The great Confederate stronghold had fallen. The war in the South was turning. Northern morale reversed almost overnight. On November 8, 1864, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected. He won the Electoral College by a massive margin. McClellan won only 3 states. Lincoln had been re-elected in the middle of the war. The people had voted to see it through. March 4, 1865. Lincoln's second inaugural address. The war was almost over. It was dying. Everyone could feel it. Lincoln stood before the crowd and delivered what many historians, and many people who know words, consider the greatest speech ever given by an American president. He looked out at a country that had torn itself apart, that had killed 600,000 of its own people, that was soaked in grief and blood. And he said this: both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. He was saying this was not simple. This was not a story of the good guys and the bad guys. This was a tragedy, an American tragedy, in which 2 sides of the same nation had slaughtered each other over something that never should have existed in the first place. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. He was saying, if this war was punishment for 250 years of slavery, then we accept that. We are not looking away from what we did. We are not pretending it was simple. And then the ending. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. With malice toward none, with charity for all. Not revenge, not bitterness, healing. Frederick Douglass was in the crowd that day, listening. Afterward, Lincoln spotted him and called him over. There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours, Lincoln said. How did you like that speech? Douglass looked at him. Mr. Lincoln, he said, that was a sacred effort. April 9, 1865. Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. General Robert E. Lee, commanding what remained of the Army of Northern Virginia, met with General Ulysses S. Grant and surrendered. The Civil War was over. Washington exploded in celebration. Cannon fired, church bells rang, people danced in the streets. Lincoln stood on the White House balcony and spoke to the crowd below. He was happier than he had been in years, maybe ever. It was April 9th, 1865. 5 days later, he went to the theater. And the whole story, everything we have watched and felt and carried, came to its shattering, unforgivable end. We are back where we started. April 14th, 1865, Good Friday. Abraham Lincoln woke up that morning in what people around him described as the best mood they had seen in years. He ate breakfast. He held a cabinet meeting, still excited, still warm, still telling stories. He went for a carriage ride with Mary in the afternoon. He told Mary, "We must be more cheerful in the future. Between the war and losing our darling Willie, we have both been very miserable." He wanted to enjoy what was coming, the peace, the healing, the country knitting itself back together. That evening, they were going to Ford's Theater to see a comedy called Our American Cousin. He didn't particularly want to go. He was tired. But it had been announced in the morning newspaper that he would attend, and he didn't want to disappoint people who had come expecting to see him. John Wilkes Booth was 26 years old. He was a famous actor, one of the biggest stars of the American theater. He was handsome and magnetic and celebrated. He was also a passionate Confederate sympathizer, consumed by rage at Lincoln's election and what he saw as the destruction of the Southern way of life. In the months before the end of the war, he had assembled a small group of co-conspirators, planning first to kidnap Lincoln and ransom him for Confederate prisoners. But the war had ended too fast. The kidnapping plan was finished. Booth changed the plan. He would kill Lincoln. His co-conspirators would simultaneously kill Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. One stroke, decapitate the leadership of the government, and perhaps the Confederacy could rise again from the chaos. Booth was at Ford's Theater that afternoon, checking his mail in the box they kept for him there. He learned that Lincoln was coming that night. He knew the theater perfectly. He had performed there many times. He knew which door led to the presidential box. He knew which moment in the play the audience would laugh the loudest. He spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. At approximately 8:30 that evening, Lincoln and Mary arrived at the theater. The performance had already started. When Lincoln appeared in the presidential box, the audience saw him and burst into applause. The orchestra played "Hail to the Chief." Lincoln smiled and gave a small bow. He sat down in the rocking chair. He leaned forward, watching the stage. The play was funny. The crowd was laughing. Mary took his hand. At approximately 10:15 p.m., there was a moment in the play that everyone in the audience knew was coming, a line that always got a huge laugh. In the darkness behind the presidential box, a door opened without a sound. John Wilkes Booth stepped through. The famous actor, the man who had spent his life performing for audiences, who knew exactly how to time a moment, waited. The line was delivered. The audience erupted. In the noise, Booth raised a small single-shot Derringer pistol. He pressed it against the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. He fired. The theater erupted. People screamed. Booth had slashed a soldier who tried to stop him and leaped from the presidential box to the stage below, a 12-foot drop that broke his left leg. He shouted something. Witnesses disagreed on exactly what, though many recalled something about tyranny, and ran through the back of the theater, mounted a horse that a young accomplice held for him, and galloped away into the Washington night. In the presidential box, Lincoln had slumped forward. He never lost consciousness in the way that would allow him to regain it. The bullet had entered the back of his skull and lodged behind his right eye. The wound was instantly, catastrophically fatal. But his body, that enormous, powerful body that had swung axes and wrestled champions and survived everything the frontier could throw at it, would not give up easily. Soldiers and doctors rushed into the box. They tried to carry him to a place where he could be tended. The theater itself was too chaotic. They carried him across 10th Street to a small boarding house called the Peterson House, owned by a man named William Peterson. There was one room with a bed long enough for him. They laid him diagonally across it, the only way his height would fit. And then began the long night. His cabinet gathered. His generals came. Surgeons worked at his wound and knew immediately that there was nothing they could do. Mary was brought across the street and collapsed into grief, so absolute that she had to be led in and out, unable to bear the sight and unable to stay away. Robert Lincoln, his eldest son, 21 years old, sat in a chair in the corner of the room and wept. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton organized the response to the crisis, keeping the government functioning, issuing orders, beginning the manhunt for Booth, while simultaneously never leaving the bedside. Lincoln's breathing was slow, labored, rhythmic. He did not move. The candles burned. Outside, Washington had gone from celebration to terror. Word spread through the city. People stood in the streets in the dark, unable to go home, not knowing what was going to happen. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Edwin Stanton stood at the bedside. He was a hard, practical, unsentimental man. He had disagreed with Lincoln about many things. He had not always been kind. He stood at the bedside of the dead president, and he said, very quietly, "Now he belongs to the ages." They brought him home. A special train, draped in black, carried Abraham Lincoln's body from Washington back to Springfield, Illinois, making stops in cities across the country so that the people could say goodbye. In Philadelphia, 300,000 people lined the streets. In New York, 500,000. In city after city, at stations and crossroads and quiet country junctions, people came to stand by the tracks as the train passed. Farmers, factory workers, mothers holding children on their shoulders, old men in their veterans' coats, and among them, gathered in the largest numbers of anyone, weeping openly, calling out the name Father Abraham, were black Americans, people who had been enslaved and were now free because of the man in that black-draped train. They had walked miles, many of them, to stand by those tracks, to say goodbye, to be there in the night as he passed. thousands and thousands of them, in the dark, holding candles. He was buried at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois, the same place he had walked with Mary in 1860, and said he hoped to be buried somewhere quiet like this someday. His wish was granted. The assassin was found 12 days later, hiding in a Virginia barn. John Wilkes Booth was shot dead by a Union soldier when he refused to surrender. And the nation, stunned, grieving, furious, heartbroken, was left to reckon with what it had lost. So, what did Abraham Lincoln leave behind? Let's start with the facts, because the facts are extraordinary. In January of 1865, Congress had passed the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. It abolished slavery, completely and permanently, throughout the entire country. In December of 1865, it was ratified by the states. Slavery was over. Every enslaved person in America was legally free. Lincoln did not live to see the ratification. He was killed 7 months before it happened. But he made it happen. The amendment could not have passed without his years of political maneuvering, his moral leadership, his willingness to stake his presidency on its passage. Over 4 million people were freed. And the Union, the United States of America, survived. It survived its own civil war. It survived the assassination of its president. It survived the deadliest internal crisis any democracy has ever faced. The government held. The elections happened. Power was transferred peacefully, even through unimaginable grief. Lincoln had staked everything on the idea that a democracy could survive its worst test. He was right. Abraham Lincoln holds a patent, making him the only president in American history to have done so. In 1849, he invented a device to lift boats over shallow water by inflating chambers beneath the hull. It was never manufactured, but Lincoln loved to tinker, to solve problems, to see the practical solution where others saw only obstacles. That curiosity never left him. On the day he was shot, April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln signed the order establishing the United States Secret Service. The agency designed to protect American presidents was created on the last day of Lincoln's life. He never benefited from its protection by a single hour. Now I need to say something important. Lincoln was not perfect. History is not simple, and Lincoln was not simple. He held views about race during his lifetime that were shaped by the prejudices of his era, views that he himself gradually moved away from, that the war and Frederick Douglass and the testimony of black soldiers changed, but views that would shock us today if we read them. He struggled with the tension between what he personally believed and what he thought the law allowed him to do. He made military decisions that cost lives. He suspended certain civil liberties during the war in ways that were controversial, even then. These things are also true, and we should know them. But also true is this: a boy was born in a one-room dirt-floor cabin in Kentucky in 1809. His mother died when he was 9. His sister died when he was 19. He never went to school for a full year of his life. He had almost no money, no connections, no path laid out for him, no one standing at the top saying, "Come up." He taught himself, from books borrowed in the dark, from a Bible read by firelight on a dirt floor, from conversations with ordinary people on an Illinois circuit, from stories told on flatboats and in taverns and in the halls of courthouses. He failed. Again and again he failed. He lost elections. He broke an engagement he shouldn't have broken. He struggled with depression for his entire adult life. He made mistakes. And he kept going. Every time he kept going. He went to New Orleans, and he saw what slavery actually was. And he did not look away, and he carried it. He went to hospital wards and held the hands of dying soldiers, and he did not look away, and he carried it. He buried a son, and he did not look away, and he carried it. He carried everything, and he kept walking forward. Here's what I want you to carry with you when this video ends. Whatever cabin you were born in, whatever poverty, whatever difficulty, whatever the world expects of you or doesn't expect of you, that is not the end of the story. It is the beginning. Lincoln proved that. He proved it with his own body and his own choices and his own refusal to stop. He also proved something about the cost of doing the right thing. It costs, sometimes enormously. Lincoln gave his life for what he believed, not metaphorically, but literally. He was murdered because he had ended slavery and preserved the Union, and made the country face something uncomfortable about itself. And he did it anyway. In Lincoln's day, the political career of a man who came from poverty and had little formal education was considered almost impossible. And yet Lincoln rose to the highest office in the world. He later said, "Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition. I have no other so great as that of being truly esteemed of my fellow men by rendering myself worthy of their esteem." He wanted to be worthy. That, more than anything else, drove him. Above the burial chamber in Lincoln's tomb in Springfield, Illinois, are carved the words Edwin Stanton spoke at the moment of Lincoln's death. Now he belongs to the ages. He does belong to the ages. He belongs to us, to everyone who believes that a person can rise from nothing, to everyone who has ever been too poor, or too different, or too underestimated, to everyone who has ever wanted to give up and decided to keep going instead, to everyone who has ever believed, really believed, in the quiet of their own heart, that the right thing is worth doing even when it costs everything. History remembers Abraham Lincoln on the pennies in your pocket, and the face carved into a mountain, and the enormous marble temple in Washington, D.C., where 1 million tourists pose for photographs. But the real Lincoln, the one I hope you carry with you, is the boy lying on the floor of a dark cabin, a book open in front of him, refusing to let the darkness win. He chose every day of his life to reach. What will you reach for? Thank you for spending this time with Abraham Lincoln. His story is your story. It is the story of this country, the one it was, the one it is, and the one it is still trying to become. He pointed the way. The rest, as he would say, is up to us.